Hello and welcome back everyone to Master Blender 3D with Wild West Environment. In the last lesson, we left ourselves off by adding this extra piece at the very bottom and going over the basics of seams and sharps. Seams mainly, the ones that we're going to make use out of to learn a little bit about the setup. In the basics video, you saw a bit of an older version. They did change up the interface a little bit, but the essence of the setup is still the same. Let's go over that real quick. Before that though, I'd like to get this entire setup, all of its pieces in one setting. So what I mean by that is let's go ahead and select it. I'm going to click G to make sure it's in the right place. And then I'm going to go on to Object. I'm going to select it all, convert everything to mesh. And now we should have a whole setup nicely done. We can click Ctrl J. There we go. All right, so now on to the next step. If you're not seeing the same shader, just in case, you can click Shade Smooth, and the angle, I think by default is 30 degrees. That's more than enough. I do like to change this up to 40 degrees, just so we could get a nicer smoothing effect, especially for the top. Make sure the top is nicely set up over here. The next step is going to be getting rid of the, if we go to wireframe, this little part over here. So that's going to be the line that we had, the edge curve. We need to just delete it, and we're going to have ourselves a clean topology. It's not just going to be empty vertices. Okay, on to the setup with the seams. I really like this part because it's just starting off the texturing, getting the colors right and whatnot. I like this a lot. Let's go on to UV editing and start the process. So what I like to do is I like to just isolate the view by clicking the isolation button like so. We're going to get this individual piece. We can then hit tab and we can see what we're working on. So by default, we're going to have on the left hand side an empty square. And even though we're not going to be using that just yet, it's nice to know that it's UV. It just shows UVs, the textures, the 2D textures that we have applied basically onto our 3D object. But again, for now, let's just focus on the seams. So what you notice is by default, we're going to have seams sharp. Those are indicated by blue edges. So everywhere we'll have black edges, but on certain edges, we will have them blue. The reason being is that they are shown as a seam sharp. When we clicked Shade Auto Smooth, it gets automatically applied with the modifier and applies that those sharp edges basically. So by default, we don't really need to worry about that. The seams though, on the other hand, they're going to be interesting because we're going to use that to unwrap our 3D object. It basically tells where the textures go, sorry, where the UVs go, where they need to be split up. And for that, we'll start off by just optimizing it a little bit. The base, we don't really need that. We can get rid of it, delete it. It's going to be hidden by a platform. So we need to just make sure we don't have anything. If we go inside, we don't have any unnecessary faces. And you can see it's somewhat of a clean topology. I do say somewhat because there's always ways you can improve it. You can really, for example, these bolts over here, they are sticking out inwards a little bit. And when I started off working with 3D modeling and texturing, I always was worried like if it's like, you know, not a perfect mesh and whatnot. But at this point, when even baking parts and whatnot, they don't really affect that much, anything of that sort. And I am looking that these bolts, if we're talking about them, they do have a setup that's a little bit too sharp. We need to increase the angle, I reckon. There we go, to hide them out of the way. So angle of 43 seems to do it. Okay. So going back to the seams, all we need to do is we need to consider how this object is going to be set up in a 2D space. So let's start from the very top. We're going to ignore the bolts, and I will explain you when we are actually unwrapping, but we're going to ignore them and just focus on this massive cylinder, which is, if we click L, notice that it is just one object. So we're going to start off by getting the top piece off. We can imagine this just being a top, just a simple circle shape. So for that, we need to just simply hold Alt and select the edge on the side. meaning that this bottom piece will be separate from the top, and we're just gonna flatten them out onto 2D space, making them like a pancake shape basically. And we can then right click, mark seam, and there we go. We're going to get ourselves a red edge. Afterwards, we can go ahead and do that same part for this over here, mark seam, and that's going to separate. Oh, did I do it right? Mark seam, there we go. We're going to separate now this bottom piece from this entire cylinder, which goes up to here. We can separate this ring, these rings, with the cylinder itself. I'm going to do it for the upper and the bottom part because they're going to be as separate objects, separate material that is, and it's just going to avoid any unnecessary UV deformities. So mark seam. I always think about when doing this how many pieces is going to be as well. So for example, right, this entire cylinder could technically be just one massive piece, but at the same time, splitting them off onto 5 different parts is still not a big deal, especially when using seamless textures. Still totally okay and fine to make use out of that. Since with seamless textures, we can just not really care about 0 to 1 UV space. If it was being baked into the textures and whatnot as a different workflow, then maybe we'd need to consider it a little bit more. But again, this particular part is still 5 pieces, not a big deal. When it comes to like more complex meshes, when it comes to hundreds of different types of pipes, for example, of that same setup, then maybe we need to start considering like maybe we should keep this as one piece. But again, this particular part is totally okay to just be separate, especially because these are going to be different material. All right, so this bottom part, I don't think we need to separate it. This can be just one mesh material. I think it's going to be more than enough, more than fine. Or actually, now that I think about it, even though this is going to be the same material, it's best to split this off. And the reason being is that we want this to look like it's a separate piece. It comes from a separate chunk. So we want to differentiate some of that noise from the texture. And for that reason, I am going to add a seam over here, just so we could make it look like it's a different piece. Even though when we look at it mesh, we can see that this sharp type of a line going across is somewhat indicative that it is a separate piece. But when we start applying material and mesh, just mixing up with the shaders, then it just might not look like it's a separate piece. So yeah, again, for that reason, we are adding a seam over here. And that's pretty much it. All we gotta do now is just consider how it's going to be set with the 2D space. Again, we just split up these parts into multiple cylindrical pieces, but we don't really tell how it's going to be unwrapped onto the 3D space. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and select one of these edges over here. We're going to hold Control, select the bottom piece. In this case, I will go out of isolation mode to see where this is selected. And we want this to be in the least conspicuous place. So maybe in the back, we can do it like this. Oh, yeah, we're going to do it in the back. So select one line, hold Control, select the bottom line. And this is not the right line. There we go. So we're going to just select that. We're only going to select lines going across here. So through the cylindrical parts, the cylinder itself, the rings, and not touch this part at the top. The reason being is that they're going to be flattened regardless. They're going to just be circular objects. This, if we think about like vertical parts, when they switch to this edge over here, well, let's get back to that in a bit. I want to firstly just right click, mark seam, so we get this out of the way. Okay, so this part, you might be considering, why are we not splitting this up in between these parts like this? So we'd have a part going across like this, and maybe some flattened parts going across like this. The reason being is that these parts are going to be folded in a 2D space, giving us just a nice line, a nice edge going across. As long as we have a way to break down this surface, which is what we did with this line over here, it's just going to give us straight line, which we'll see in a bit once we start working with the unwrapping. All in all though, that's pretty much it. In regards to bolts, they are just, let me show you, they are just simple parts like this. They can be flattened out into just 2D space. If you imagine this just being 2D like this, that's what's going to look like, except the parts on the end is just going to be extended a little bit to give us more density for the sides. But honestly, we don't really need to touch them. They're going to be fine just as is. So yeah, not a big deal. Pretty good setup. We got ourselves some seams. Oh, I'm going to click Alt and H just to make sure I go out of that preview mode. We got ourselves the entire setup. So thank you so much for watching, and I will be seeing you in a bit.